Hello, everyone. Welcome. I'm just going to give people a minute to come in, connect to audio, and then we'll get started. Thank you for coming tonight. If you want to get us started in the chat, we're always interested to know where people are calling in from. I'm in the Bronx on Lenape land. Where are you? What time is it? Also, anything you want to share about what brings you here? It's always nice to get a sense of our crew. And then I think we can get started. So welcome. My name is Amy Starcheski. I direct the Oral History Master of Arts program here at Columbia. And tonight's event is special because it celebrates one of the 2023 winners of the Jeffrey H. Brodsky Oral History Award, which is given to one or more students annually whose thesis makes an important contribution to knowledge, which this does, and most exemplifies the rigor, the creativity, and the ethical integrity that OMA teaches as students. And this year, actually, taken together the work of our three Brodsky Award winners is what inspired the theme of our series, which is experiments in oral history methodology. I'm sad to share that in July 2023, Jeff Brodsky passed away at age 49 after battling Parkinson's disease for the past decade. And when I'm done talking, I'll drop a link in the chat that shares some of our reflections on his life and work. Rebecca Kiil's thesis, which we'll experience tonight, was awarded a special Brodsky Award for methodological innovation. To say a little bit about her, well, you'll get to know her and her family well tonight, I think. She's a writer, an oral historian, and a filmmaker. She earned her BA in English from Wake Forest University and attended the Salt Institute for Graduate Studies in Documentary and Film Photography. OMA can be done in a year for full-time students. It can also be done part-time, and part-time students often do it in 2 years, but some people who are working full-time take up to 4, and I get to know those 4-year students really well, and Rebecca was one of them. While we worked together, I watched her daughter become a teenager. I watched her lose her grandmother, go through many other life transitions, and her ethical commitment, her creativity, and her care really made it a joy to go through every step of that process of supporting her and her work. So please join me in welcoming Rebecca Kiil, and you're all in for a treat tonight to hear about her work. I'll share I'm feeling a little under the weather, so I might keep my camera off, but I'm here and listening.
Good evening. Thank you so much, Amy. I first just want to say what an honor and pleasure it is to be here this evening and thank all of you for being here. I also want to thank Amy and Solmi for your help in getting here tonight and the faculty and staff at OMA for inviting me here today. I'm also going to share my screen. So just give me 1 minute to do this correctly. So my favorite thing to do, and the thing my body knows best how to do because I grew up doing it, is listening to people's stories, their lives, their histories, and the events that they've lived through. My siblings and I grew up surrounded by the stories. Our grandparents told the stories over and over coffee at the end of every family gathering. My father and mother were born in the small northern European country of Estonia, and their families fled from Estonia during the same month of World War II in September 1944 to escape the brutality of the alternating Soviet and Nazi occupations, which had already claimed some of their family members and would have led to their families' certain imprisonment or death. During my childhood, it seemed like all of my grandparents were telling stories, but what I did not grasp at the time, and what I now perceive to be the deafening silences on my mother's side of the family. In my thesis, I explored some of these examples within my own family history, and I discovered multiple layers of silencing. sometimes by external forces and sometimes self-imposed silences. I grappled with questions that can be applied universally to, I think, and I hope to examine some of those with you tonight. As an oral historian, I believe in the value of a single person's story in their own words. How then do I capture the story of my maternal grandfather, whose voice I've never heard, whose voice was silenced by the state and by censors, by members of his family and by my own? How do I preserve the stories of my mother's family members who were forcibly disappeared? How do I record the stories of my mother's family? How do I record the stories if they're not around to tell us what really happened, if the state has disappeared any trace of them? The work that brought me to the Columbia Oral History Master of Arts program, or OMA, and that continues today, has me haunted by the stories of the missing, the disappeared, and the silenced. And what do those left behind do without answers, without resolution? Is there a way to give voices to those silences? My family's silences were kept for more than 70 years, so I need to take a few minutes to give you some historical context. On this map of Europe during World War II, Estonia is the tiny country at the top right of the detail box, the yellow one at the very top there. So moving that detail box over to the right, Estonia is at the top in the right-hand corner in green. So as I said, both of my families fled in September of 1944, along with tens of thousands of other Estonians from what had already been several years of dueling Soviet and Nazi occupations. And that second Soviet occupation would ultimately last 50 more years. The three red arrows in the upper right-hand corner of your screen, pointing toward the more detailed black lines, represent the journeys the three branches of my family took to escape. On September 8th, 1944, my father was 4 years old. His parents waded into the sea off the west coast of Estonia in the dark with my father and sister on their shoulders. They waded in the water until a fishing boat picked them up and brought them safely to Sweden. They remained in Sweden for 4 years, living in refugee camps until they were sponsored to come to New York City in 1948, so my grandfather could pastor an Estonian church in Harlem. This church is where my parents finally met. In 1941, 3 years before my mother was born, her uncle and grandfather were arrested and disappeared during the first Soviet occupation. So when the Soviets invaded Estonia for the second time in 1944, my grandmother knew that if she, her mother, or her daughter were caught by the Soviet regime, they would also be arrested or killed or sent to Siberia. On September 20th, 1944, my mother was a baby, and my grandfather, Harald, was deployed as an army physician. But my grandmother knew that she had to leave their home. She tried to leave word so my grandfather could find them. My grandmother traveled with my mother, my great-grandmother, and my mother's nanny. They had a nanny since both of my grandparents were doctors and often out during the night on house calls. And then my great-grandmother had adopted a war orphan who was 9 years old. So there were 5 of them, 5 women and children. The all-female group was swept up in the tens of thousands of other Estonians who were also fleeing at that same time. They kept moving, trying to put as much space as possible between them and the Soviet regime, traveling by ship, train, or on foot. At one point, they spent 5 weeks on foot, pulling a wagon with my mother sitting on top of their bundles. My grandmother didn't know where my grandfather was or if he'd be able to catch up with them. So the third branch of of that map shows my maternal grandfather. So in September 1944, my maternal grandfather, Harald, quickly realized he couldn't catch up with his family, so he went into hiding. He stripped himself of his identity papers, and he lived like that for several months until December 1944, when he and two other men found a boat and escaped to a tiny island off the coast of Finland. They were rescued by a family who advised them to continue traveling to Sweden and not stay in Finland, since Finland had recently signed an agreement with the Soviet Union to turn over any Estonians who had escaped to Finland. For some reason, my grandfather and his friends did not go to Sweden, and they ended up in Finnish custody. Eventually, they were sent to a Finnish internment camp where they stayed for a few months and then were eventually turned over to Soviet authorities. My grandfather spent 1 year in prison in Leningrad and then was sent to a Siberian labor camp for 8 years. He never left Siberia. So, in my mother's family, only the women made it to freedom during the war. They traveled together, stayed in refugee camps in the Allied zone in Germany for 5 years until they were sponsored to come to the United States in 1949. They lived together in the United States and helped support one another. My great-grandmother lived with my grandmother until her death at 103 years of age, but they never talked about the struggles or the men they lost. And growing up, we didn't talk about the men in my mother's family. These are the men my mother's family lost. My mother's uncle, Endel Bern, who disappeared on June 1st, 1940. My mother's grandfather, Carl Pern, who disappeared on June 3rd, 1940, 2 days later. And then my mother's father, Harald Tool, who was jailed in Helsinki and then in an internment camp outside of Helsinki for several months, and then imprisoned in Leningrad for a year, and then in a Siberian labor camp for 8 years, and then in Siberia, he lived for the rest of his life till he died in 1985. We don't know if he was never able to leave, or we're not sure. But in addition to being silenced by the state, these men were also silenced on another level, in that the women never talked about them amongst themselves, never really mentioned their names, and that silence carried into the next generation with my mother and the next with their grandkids. We didn't talk about my grandfather. We didn't really have photos of him around. I think there was one that I remember my mother having. We didn't really know what he was like. We didn't hear stories about him. I really knew not to ask about him. So even if the women who lost these men thought about them, which I'm sure they did, keeping their memories alive within themselves, for those of us who never knew them, they might as well never have existed. Just one note, I said earlier that we grew up hearing stories and that it seemed like everyone was telling the stories, except I realized later that my maternal grandmother wasn't, but there was one story that my maternal grandmother told, and she told it so many times, it seemed like she was telling stories too. It was a story of a wagon, and it's strange to think about how prominent that story was. While below that story, there were all these silences. And I wonder if she told that story so often so that it seemed as though she was telling her stories when everybody else was. But I'm going to play a clip that weaves the story of the women's escape in with their losses and what they.
There was always something going on in the house between all of the five women who lived together. it was pretty volatile a lot of the times. Just the personalities were volatile. Not that it was very negative, but I think they were just loud and felt safe, maybe expressing their differences of opinion.
You know what Vega is? Well, I didn't know about really my father's and my brother's fate, what happened when we left. But in my heart I felt that my father and my brother are dead, but Harald was alive. I didn't know whether I was doing the right thing or not. And physically I was exhausted. I felt a great responsibility to take care of Mal, Mother, Ludi and Nanny. I told Nanny not to come to us. She said, I'm coming with you no matter what, or whatever happens to you. So she was an old lady, but she was a tough one. And I appreciated so much that she stayed with me.
Do you remember ever kind of processing any of that?
I don't.
It just wasn't really discussed.
It wasn't, well, it wasn't discussed, I think.
Did Mom ever ask you questions about it? Like
Well,
as she was growing up,
no,
did she ever?
no, she never asked me about it.
So
Neither did my mother. My mother we never discussed it. I don't think I ever discussed the Harald problem with her. It was too hurtful, too painful to talk about it. So I was quiet about it and carried it all within me. All these years. That's all I can say.
When my grandmother was in her 90s, she decided she was ready to tell her story. That's when she and I began working together to document her experiences and what eventually led me to Columbia's OMA program. It was at this point, she was in her 90s, I was in my 40s, that we first began unsilencing both histories and people, including her brother and her father, who I knew had been arrested and disappeared, but I didn't know anything more about them. And this is also when she finally started talking to me about my grandfather, Harald. Prior to this, all I knew about my grandfather was that he had been captured during the war, had been sent to Siberia and never left, and that he was a very well-respected doctor. This next clip is from the very first interview where my grandmother agreed to talk to me about Harald. And in the, you'll hear me ask her about him, and I can hear myself like trying to not jump out of my seat with excitement. But also, I remember being so surprised when she started talking about him at how warmly she talks about him, and how sweet her memories were, since I thought we were all angry at him. And this is one of my favorite moments from the interview, when she talks about bringing my infant mother home. for the first time from the hospital, and that Harald is just so crazy in love with the baby that he runs off with her.
So today, how would you feel about talking about Harald?
Well, this is a more difficult subject to talk about than
Yeah.
my brother and my father, because it's very deep inside of me, and in spite of all these years, I still have in my heart. But in a certain way, I'm even glad that he passed away. I think it would have been much harder when he still would be alive.
Since we never spoke about Harald, I'm surprised by the amount of warmth and love and ease she displays as she shares her memories of those early years with him during the war when my mother was a baby. So after the baby was born, you were all in Ansla.
We came back to Ansla by taxi, and when we arrived to Ansla, then Harald, he just grabbed the baby from the taxi and ran off into the house, you know. I was, what happened, you know?
Where did everybody go?
Where did he go with the baby? Well, anyway.
So he was excited.
He was so excited about it, yes.
So this very night, the night of the Harald interview, was the night when this project really shifted for me. My grandmother sent me home that night with my grandfather's diary, which is pictured here. It's probably like 6 inches by 4 inches, tiny diary that he kept in his pocket. He started that diary somewhat prophetically, I would say, after he and my grandmother parted for what would be the last time. In the diary, he documented his attempts to catch up with his family. He wrote about all the months he was trying to escape from Estonia, his ultimate escape on the boat to Finland, his imprisonment in Finland, and every moment until he was basically turned over to the Soviet authorities. And when I read his diary that night, I read the whole thing. I think I was up till 4 that morning. I recognized in his thought patterns my own, and I wondered what it might have been like to know him. So I just wanted to know more and more and more and more about him. So at that point, this project became my own. My grandmother and I worked together for 7 years until she died at the age of 102. I recorded at least 11 formal interviews with her, I think, and countless other informal ones, and was privileged to be able to spend hundreds, I would say, hours of conversation with her over tea. In the end, I heard most of her stories numerous times. Her stories now live in various places in my body. Her questions have become my questions, and I became desperate to find answers for her. I traveled to Estonia once while she was alive and once after she'd passed away, to the archives in Estonia to try to find any documentation available about the arrests and fates of her brother, her father, and Harald. And to this day, we still don't know what happened to her brother. And her questions about Harald, why had he never left Siberia? Was he not allowed to, or did he choose not to? Why hadn't he accepted her help in the 1960s when she wanted to work with the US government for his release from Siberia to bring him to the US? Was he really scared for his family or his own safety? Or did he choose not to come to the United States because of what we found out many years later, that at some point he'd had a son in Siberia and was living with another woman? While she was alive, I was very protective of my grandmother. Delving into these memories that she'd shut out for so long was painful for her, especially since she could never find the answers she needed and she would never have closure. I wanted to protect her, but I also wanted to know as much as possible. about Harald, since he'd been kept from me up to that point. I understood the pain he'd caused, but I also understood that he'd suffered tremendously in prison and in the labor camp, and I wanted to understand more about the circumstances of his life, what he'd actually experienced versus what others had said about him. We never heard anything directly from him, but rather through multiple layers of other people, like a twisted, unreliable game of telephone. After my grandmother died, I continued my search to know Harald. My grandmother died in 2020, right before COVID. And in the summer of 2022, I took a leave of absence from my job to spend the summer in Estonia. I wanted to live in the spaces and walk in the places where my grandparents lived and walked. All of my grandparents, but I was especially interested in visiting the spaces where Harald had been, where he and my grandmother met in medical school, which is this building. Well, this is one of the buildings, where they lived where my mother was a baby in this town. I went back to the archives and found more documentation, Soviet documentation, this time covering the time of his first imprisonment in Leningrad, where this photo was taken. We met his son, my mother's half-brother, for the first time that summer on a video call. He lives in Siberia and speaks only Russian, so my mother's cousin translated for us. He's only a few years older than I am. He's the man in the photo on the bottom left of the screen, and he's the one in the middle. And I was taken aback by how much he looks like my brother. My brother's in the photo on the right. I remember when we were younger, people sometimes saying that my brother took after Harald or reminded them of him. And I'm guessing by how much my brother looks like Harald's son that they were right about that. Also, while we were in Estonia that summer, the stars aligned perfectly because my mother, daughter, and I had an incredible opportunity to visit that tiny Finnish island where Harald and his two companions landed when they escaped from Estonia in their broken boat. And we met the son of one of the men who rescued them and whose family hosted them and encouraged them to keep going to Sweden. And the family who currently lives on the island spent hours with us poring over Harald's diary, walking us through his entries alongside the accompanying buildings he referenced. It was so surreal to move within those spaces, imagining him there in the condition he'd been in, trying to make decisions about what to do next, not knowing those were his last 5 days of freedom before he'd end up first in the custody of Finnish authorities and then eventually in the hands of the Soviets, headed to prison and then Siberia. For so long, I had been angry at Harald, first as a child, not really knowing why, I just knew that I shouldn't ask about him. And then later, I was angry as a proxy for my grandmother's pain. But it took walking in his footsteps, figuratively, going to a week-long workshop in Estonia and learning about what life was like under the Soviet system and the twisted cruelty of KGB tactics, the brutality of the deportations, and also walking in his footsteps, literally, spending time in the city and the university where he and my grandmother met, driving to the town where my mother was a baby and they lived as a young couple, and then miraculously traveling to that island where he landed with the two other men and where they were free for that short period of time. Having my body in the spaces where his body had been and hearing about what life was like and might have been like helped me imagine possibilities and perspectives that I hadn't been able to see before. So when it came time to write my thesis, I wanted to hear from Harald. I'd heard everyone else and wanted him to be able to have his say. So after almost 10 years of working on the project and almost 5 years of part-time study at OMA doing oral history interviews, it seemed like an interview of my grandfather was the natural next step. This is the farm where I imagined my interview of Harald taking place. This is, well, was in fact Harald's family farm. I took this photo in our 2014 visit to Estonia. And I imagined the interview taking place here outside overlooking this beautiful lake. I imagined that the interview would take place like now, with my grandparents being elderly but cognizant. And after I would have done all of my research, after we knew all we did about what had happened, after my grandmother had come to the peace she had come to, so we could talk about and through all of these topics and difficult events. I imagined I would have contacted my grandfather and he would have been so excited to finally meet me and so happy to finally see my mother and relieved to be seeing my grandmother and feeling like they could find a space of forgiveness. In my imagination, he would come to this interview to be totally open and honest. He had never been able to be open or speak freely before because of circumstances outside of his control. For the purposes of this presentation, I pulled two like scenes out of the fantasy oral history that I created. All of the questions that I asked in the oral history or the fantasy oral history were real questions that my grandmother or my family had, or I had. The answers were created. Some of them were more based on more facts than others. In the two that I picked, one was a question from my grandmother about why Harald turned himself over to the Finnish authorities. This really, really bothered her that a man who was so intelligent would be so, in her words, stupid to turn himself over to the authorities when, it ended up in him being sent to Siberia. And then my mother's question was, what I picked for this was, in 1975, when Estonia was still behind the Iron Curtain, my father, mother, and sister traveled to Estonia, but they stopped first in Leningrad, and they had sent notice, well ahead of time through many family members to try to get word to Harald, who was still in Siberia, but had traveled to Estonia to visit his elderly parents. So this was known that he could get permission to travel to Estonia. So they were hoping that he could get permission to meet my mother in Leningrad. There was no confirmation, but my mother was hoping that if she sent word that she would be there, that he would come. So my mother, father, and sister went, and they spent 3 days in Leningrad. They went sightseeing during the day and came back to the hotel every night, and he never showed and never made any contact and never afterward made any contact or excuse for why he didn't show up. So her question would be why he didn't show up. And so the two scenes that I wanted to create like a dramatic reading for this presentation were for these two questions. So there were all different scenarios of how we would create a dramatic reading for this evening. And we ended up, I ended up kind of doing a last minute totally different thing with my family. Because, and I want to thank the people that volunteered from the students who volunteered. I really appreciate you doing that. And I ended up doing something different with my family because I wanted to try one more level of experimentation with this project, like a different level of unsilencing with my family. My family, aside from my parents, haven't read my thesis. So I thought this might be another opportunity to share part of that. That was one thought I had. Any chance I have to share this work with my daughter is another chance to sort of share my family's experience with her, but also I involved my siblings, my sister and my brother. But also one hope that I've had through this whole project has been to be able to hear my grandfather's voice. And in fact, a student asked me once about that, and I have not been able to hear my grandfather's voice. I can't conjure it. And it just occurred to me a couple of days ago that I remembered this comment that people have made about my brother, reminding them of my grandfather, and then this picture of of Harold's son looking like my brother, and I started to think about whether my brother sounds like Harold would have, and then I thought that maybe my brother should read Harold's voice, and maybe I have been hearing Harold's voice out of my brother and hadn't even realized it. So we did this experiment, and my family members and I read a scene from my fantasy oral history. So I am now going to play you the first excerpt, which is the answer to my grandmother's question about why my grandfather was so stupid to turn himself over to the Finnish authorities. And this particular answer, to me, I feel the answer became much clearer to me once my mother and I spent time in Finland and spent that time in the spaces where my grandfather spent those last 5 days of freedom. So we don't know the answer, but I felt that I could imagine the answer to this a little more easily. So I'm going to play this. It's about 5 minutes long. Mostly you're going to hear my brother Alan, who plays my grandfather Harold. If any of us speak, I'm in the middle playing the narrator. My daughter Sophia is on the right. She's playing me. My mother is on the bottom playing my grandmother, and my sister is on the bottom right playing. So I'm going to go ahead and play that.
Sometimes I'm not sure which parts are real and which are dreams or nightmares. For such a long time, I used my mind to play tricks on my body just to stay alive. So sometimes I can't tell what's real and what isn't. I can't quite believe this is real. Are we here by my lake sitting peacefully? Am I forgiven? Are Aino and I at peace? Is Malan Kene here beside me? I don't know.
Harold shakes his head. He takes his time to gather his thoughts before he continues. Tears are streaming down Aino's cheeks.
For a long time, I was strong. I thought I would get through it and find you. I'd been through difficult times. We'd all been through difficult times. I survived hunger, war. I could recover from those. But the boat, that, I don't know how to say. It changed how I viewed my fate, mortality. We almost died that night. I'd been hurt before, in danger, but that night was different. Something about the cold, the dark, the disorientation of not being able to rely on the person next to you, being so vulnerable for so long. Something in my mind or spirit broke on that trip, and I don't think it ever quite healed. Some confidence or hope or feeling that God had his hand on me disappeared that night. I've tried to get it back. I sometimes pretend that I've gotten it back, but I haven't. It's still missing. It feels like a complete and utter abandonment by the world, the planet, all the forces of science and math and medicine that I studied and through which the world always made sense to me. Everything betrayed me that night. Even you.
Harold looks at Aino and Mal. Aino and Mal look up, surprised and confused.
You both abandoned me that night. I couldn't conjure you in my mind as hard as I tried. I kept trying to calm my mind by thinking of you, but I couldn't. My body, my mind, perhaps because of the the hypothermia, perhaps because I was in shock, wouldn't do what I wanted it to do, what I wanted it to. So I couldn't even find you. I was completely alone in the dark on the sea, facing deadly waves, the height of mountains, the temperatures of icebergs. My comrades and I, well, one was useless on the bottom of the boat, couldn't control the boat because it was broken, and nature didn't seem to be inclined to just take us down with the breakers and let us be done with it. It seemed to want to terrorize us. So there we were, adrift and at the mercy of the sea, in what felt like an unending nightmare.
Harold closes his eyes. It's obvious that this memory is still very clear and painful. It takes him a few moments to gather himself.
Well, after many long hours, it did end. And as you know, in the morning, we landed on a rock island in Finland and were rescued by those young men and brought to their lovely family. Rest and sauna and kindness were a balm after so many painful hours on top of difficult weeks and months we had been living in hiding, trying to evade the authorities. I surprised myself by letting down my guard so easily with them. I was exhausted, so maybe I just didn't have any fight left. But even there, while resting, my body still felt terror. They tried to tell us to get back in the boat, to keep going to Sweden. In that moment, though, I couldn't imagine anything more terrifying. I kept wishing we had drowned at sea. I didn't want to be a coward and commit suicide, but I just could not get back into that boat for an even longer trip to Sweden. The family was very kind and told us not to rush, but I also knew that our being there was putting them in danger. So what were our choices? Get on our broken boat to try to get to Sweden? No. Stay and put the family in danger? No. We could take our chances in the city, go honestly as officers and try to talk as equals to fellow officers, or try to find friends who could help us out. It wasn't a great option, but it was the only one that felt possible in that moment. Obviously, we made the wrong choice.
So what did I want to achieve with this oral history that I wrote? I really wanted the four voices to speak to each other. My mother, my grandmother, Harald, and myself. There were such walls where communication couldn't penetrate. First, because of the war and just absolutely no communication. And then because of Harold was in prison, there was no way to communicate with him. Then they had to go through family members, and there were family members that were not reliable to go through and were twisting kind of communications. I just wanted to imagine an open, honest area of communication where they could say everything they needed to say and leave feeling in peace. I also wanted answers to all the questions that haunted my grandmother, and that were just continually spinning in her mind and then eventually in mine. And like I said, I wanted to hear Harold's voice, which I didn't necessarily achieve unless I now am hearing it in my brother's voice. So I did write the entire first draft of the piece. I wrote it out by hand, and I wrote it from beginning to end. I just let all of my questions out and let my thoughts flow freely, so my brain could pull from all of my experiences, all of the interviews over the years with my grandmother, conversations with my mother and father, the 2 months that I've been in Estonia, all of the classes that I attended when I was there, you know, the lectures about the Soviet times and KGB tactics and things I had learned from talking with people over there. And also from the experience that my mother and I had in Finland. And I just tried to almost like free associate and just pull from all of those experiences to try to come up with any answer that would make any sense to find answers to those questions. All of the experiences and images and memories flowed through me into the answers to those questions. So when I asked my last question and put down the pen that night, I felt as though Harald himself had connected all the dots for me and for us. Logically in my brain, I knew that I had answered the questions, but my body couldn't tell the difference, and my body felt at peace when I was finished. In terms of my mother, I was nervous to have her read it, and my father, but it really led to some really interesting questions and conversations. First, about how awkward it was for her to read her voice coming out of my brain. She mostly disagreed with how angry I made her sound. She said she would never be that angry or disrespectful. She would always be respectful no matter the circumstances. So we had to make a lot of changes to the wording of her responses to her father. She did say that she felt the same way I did, which was interesting, about the sense of closure. Even though she knew I had written the responses, she, I guess, respected the research I had done. And, you know, even though she knew that we were filling in a lot of gaps for facts that we didn't have, she felt a sense of closure, that the responses made enough sense that she could feel peaceful. But still, like, questioning the value of an exercise like this to anyone outside of myself, just more than just some sort of creative outlet. I thought about this one interaction my mother and I had, which seemed to me a really innocuous exchange that I would have imagined between my mother and Harald at their first few moments of meeting after so many decades. I imagined that he would greet her with the nicknames he used for her in all of the letters and diary entries in real life. I've pored over his writings. I'm so familiar with them. So he would use two nicknames, Nuku, which means doll, and Malekene, which means little Mal in real life. And so when I wrote the oral history, I really didn't think much about using these. I used them in this first meeting that he had with her. And I imagined the joy with which he would have approached her after so much time. But you have to remember that we did not talk about Harald growing up. So even though my grandmother and I were so focused on him, my mother hadn't been. And so I'm going to play a short clip of this discussion with my mother with you after she read my fantasy oral history for the first time.
It was almost strange to read his addressing me with my name and then with the nicknames, you know. I think that brought a little bit of discomfort too. I just haven't heard it. I'm not used to hearing it. Well, this is what Art would have said. This is why little girls need fathers, because
yeah, would have been nice to hear though, right? Yeah, I would have loved to have heard that for you. Would that have been nice to have heard?
oh, I'm sure it would have. It just
Felt weird.
felt weird to read it and to imagine it happening. I don't
Okay,
think
but did you
this-
feel like, ooh, that feels weird and uncomfortable, or were you like, oh gosh, I wish that had happened?
No, I think primarily my thought was it felt strange and different, and strange and different make it kind of uncomfortable.
Did anyone use terms of endearment for you? Was anybody sweet and cuddly with you when you were little?
Well, I think Mem was at times, and Nanny was.
Okay. Did you have nicknames for
Oh,
you,
nickname.
little sweet nicknames
Well,
for you?
yeah, Noku.
Because he did call you that.
Yeah.
Those were his nicknames for you in the
Right.
letters and
Right.
in the diary. He called you that.
Right.
And in when she talks about him having his daddy's hour, that's what he called
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
in person.
Yeah.
You don't remember that, obviously. So people did have nicknames and were sweet with you.
Yeah, but not, I mean, not the women, really.
That's what
very
I'm saying.
much.
Was
Yeah.
anybody like that with you?
Not in the same way that her father would have been, probably.
Interesting. That's why it felt weird.
Yeah.
It didn't feel weird because it was a weird thing. It felt weird because you never felt that. Oh, that makes me sad.
It was almost strange.
So this was a really powerful moment for me to revisit and recording, and it connected me immediately to my relationship to my father and the nicknames he had for me when I was young, our close relationship, and then trying to imagine a childhood without that. I never really imagined my mother's childhood without her father because she never spoke about him. So this moment made that very real. And just thinking that a fictional work could trigger such an emotional response in my mother and then lead to this conversation between the two of us about something true and deeply buried tells me that there is value in this notion of filling in the gaps and the silences where oral histories may not be able to reach with creative alternatives. So in conclusion, I approached this oral history fantasy experiment with the hope of unsilencing my grandfather. If I'm honest, it's probably my own voice that I hear still, but I created the answers that I needed to hear. The absence of Harald and the absences of his voice in the family and the deficit his absence created was so impactful that it forced me to create a voice. Finally meeting and getting to know the ghosts of my family through my grandmother answered some questions and raised so many more. Is oral history methodology applicable once the moment to record first-person testimony has passed? Who gets to tell the story and what do they get to tell? Who didn't get to speak and what is our obligation to them? Most of these questions I'm still working on answering. Many of them continue to inform my work as an oral historian, I hope for many years to come. I want to shift a little bit, take some time to give you all a chance to reflect on silences in your own history or in your family. I'm going to let Solby take control of the screen, and we're going to do a little bit of an interactive activity, but it's anonymous, and it's going to be just anonymous. We're just gonna do a little bit of reflection on silences in our own stories. And so Solby, can you pull that up? And then essentially we're just gonna put a couple of questions up there, reflection questions, and then we can use our phones to answer the questions, and then the responses will show on the screen anonymously, but you'll see them kind of in a group. So kind of like a pool of responses.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. So the tool we'll be using, I'm sure a lot of folks have heard about Mentimeter. So I'm just gonna send the link in the chat right now. And then I'm going to share my screen so that we can see. Okay. So I'm just going to so you can either join, type in the link menti.com and then type in this 8-digit code, or you can use your phone and scan the QR code here to type in your responses. But once you type them in, we should be able to start gathering people's thoughts, and they'll show up on the screen. So I'm just going to leave this up.
And we'll leave, like a couple minutes for each response. So the first question is, name a silence or an unanswered question in your or your family story. Oh, can we copy the code into the chat? Yes. You mean the numeric code? Okay, great. Maybe like one more minute, Colby. We'll move to the next one. There's
Okay.
still a lot of responses coming in, so maybe we'll get another minute or so.
I'll just keep scrolling down.
So many silences, yeah. We should move to the number 2.
Okay, perfect. Um,
Okay, where does that silence or unanswered question live in your body? I think you're able to have several responses here.
you can also, in the bottom right corner, there should be a couple reaction buttons. My cursor is kind of hovering over them now. But if you see a response that you resonate with, you can just react to them with one of these buttons.
Okay, should we go to the next one?
Yes. Okay.
What aspect of your life has been impacted by this silence or unanswered question? you so much to everybody for responding to these. I'm watching this is I don't know, for me it's like a very healing to see uh people sharing their own silences and I don't know, to just relating to all of these if um just feel not so alone. So thank you for sharing all of your responses. I think we had one more question that I'm also really curious about. I wrote because I'm a writer, my way of processing the silences was through writing, and I wondered if people had thoughts about other ways to address these silences, other forms the unsilencing could take, or genres, or if people have done something similar in other ways. Wonderful. Mm.
Oops. Let's see. Sorry, 1 second. Um, okay,
Yep, you did
sorry about that.
it.
Not letting me add new things. I think we might have. Is anyone else
Oh,
able to add new ones?
um,
This is also a good brainstorm already.
let me refresh and so that folks can add to their responses. Um,
Oh, it looks like we can vote on the ones that are there.
Actually,
Oh, now we can
sorry,
respond.
I just
Yeah.
reset. So if folks want to either resubmit or submit new responses, I think you should be able to do that now.
Yeah.
Just gonna hide the QR code.
Well, I want to thank everybody for all of your input and amazing suggestions. I'm hoping we can save these responses and go through them all because I skimmed them quickly, but
Yes, I think
are
we
we able
can.
to save those? Okay, great. And I want to thank everybody for coming. We do have a little time left. If people have comments or questions or
There's
yeah.
a bunch of questions in the chat. Maybe I'll start at the bottom in sharing some of them. Myra wants to know how the diary was obtained, and had your family looked through it before it was handed to you?
The diary story is an amazing story in itself. My grandfather had a sense of the fact that he was going to be handed over to the Soviets. So he gave the diary to a nurse and asked that it be sent to friends in Sweden. It was not given to friends in Sweden. It was given to a newspaper. And the newspaper started printing sections of it as a serial in an Estonian newspaper in Sweden. And some friends of my grandmother, who was in a DP camp in Germany, saw it and recognized like the characters in the diary or like in the story. No names were used because my grandfather was very careful, but they wrote to my grandmother in the camp, in the DP camp, and said, I think Harald's diary is in the newspaper. And she said, no, that can't be. He doesn't keep a diary. And they sent her the article, and she knew that it was him. So she wrote to the newspaper and got the diary, and that she was in the refugee camp, and they sent her this diary. So she had it. And I think it had been some time after the separation, but she got this diary in the camp, and then she knew kind of what had happened to him and has had it all these years. So she translated it and has had it, for 70 years. Yeah, so I just finally read it, a few years ago.
There's a lot of appreciation in the chat, also a lot of suggestions of other works that are related, a lot of folks shouting out Cydia Hartman, who I know you know and appreciate. There's maybe two more questions, and also if folks have questions they want to ask out loud, feel free to raise your hands. I'll ask maybe both of them well, maybe one at a time. So Jasmarie says, how did you build the trust with your mother and grandmother for them to entrust you with their stories, specifically memories and stories that have been kept secret for so long?
Well, my grandmother was ready to tell her story. But it was over 7 years of talking, and really it took 7 years for some of the stories to come out. And it just took time, and it was a really I think it was more, I think there was trust there. I think it was more about her being ready to tell things when she was ready to tell them. I feel really, really lucky to have had that time with her. I feel so honored that she and I had the relationship that we had, and that we had the time, and that she did trust me. I mean, in the end, with the things that she told me, it was quite an amazing experience, but it just took time, a lot of time. Yeah. Oh, I think you're muted, Amy.
Sorry. And Amanda says, I love all the different methodologies you use to fill in the silences. How did you choose these methods for each silence and or story?
Well, I think really it's just been experimentation, and I feel again like so lucky to have done this over such a long period of time. I feel like I haven't been rushed, and like Amy and Oma have given me the time to be I think because I've had so much time, it's allowed me like to be more creative. I haven't felt rushed. I've also had time to learn new things, and I don't know, I'm just a person who needs time to sit with things, and um like this thing this week with the dramatic reading. I know we're not very dramatic in the reading. That's because I threw this thing at my siblings, but this just kind of came to me as like a different way to do something, but it's because I wasn't really, I don't know, things just come to me slowly. So I think I just have had the opportunity to have a long runway and do things over time. So I was lucky enough to have that time. And I had a long time with my grandmother too, which 102, I feel so lucky to have had her for a long period of time. And we had the opportunity for her to be even at OMA. So she and I got to do a lot of things at Columbia because she was 102. So uh so yeah, just time. I've been lucky with a lot of time.
It was really special when she came to our class. I always still talk about and remember that. And knowing a bit of the story of this project, I feel like different class assignments or angles from different classes kind of like pulled out different pieces of the story
Yep.
as we were experimenting with different methodologies and different angles.
Mhm.
Is there anyone, I want to give a space for people who want to ask a question out loud. Does anybody have anything that they want to ask? There's more in the chat too, but don't want to marginalize the talkers since we're in an oral history session here.
Sure, I can go ahead.
Sure, go ahead.
I actually typed it in the chat, but I didn't realize we'd get an opportunity. But I kind of got this from another question, but it reminded me that earlier in the presentation I was wondering about Harald's diary and how it became a part of your work. So I wanted to know if it was a suggestion from your grandmother to look through it, or if you got that idea yourself, and whether you knew you would incorporate it in your work the moment you first read it, or you had the idea later that it would be helpful in this fantasy oral history.
I'm trying to remember. I think that I knew about the diary, but I can't remember that far back. I think that I knew about the diary before she let me read it. But as soon as I read that diary, I was obsessed with it. I just felt like I think I wrote this somewhere. It was like she opened a vault for me. It was such a huge moment when she gave me that diary. It was such a huge moment for her to have that conversation with me. That was just like a complete turning point when we had that interview and she gave me that diary. It was like just the fact that she was talking about him, and then it just like she just opened everything for me that day. And it was when I read that diary that I started thinking about this little island in Finland and would I go there. So that was like 10 years before we actually got there. So that diary sort of laid the groundwork for this whole journey to finding Harald. And I think I tried really hard not to be overwhelming with my obsession about Harald when she was alive. This was her story we were telling, but I was pretty obsessed with learning everything about him. So once I read that diary, because I really did feel that I related a lot to how he thought, and I think he was probably an introvert like me, and maybe I was over relating to him, but I felt like I really was relating a lot to him. So that diary was a game changer. Yeah.
Annie has a question. Annie, go ahead.
Hi, Rebecca. I was wondering if you could share more about the conversation that you had with your mother's half-brother, and kind of if that brought up, if that answered some questions or just kind of created more questions. Yeah, thank you.
That conversation was not really very much of a conversation. It was because he spoke only Russian, and we had to just be really careful because of the political situation and not really knowing what his political situation really is or was. So really mostly it was just like a meet and greet. My mother's cousin also doesn't really know, like they kind of keep in touch, but I really don't know what his situation is at all. I don't know really exactly what his wife does or what he does. It was really mostly just to say hi. Like now we've met, but I don't know unless we met in person if I could really ever like get a feel for him or what we could actually talk about. So it was basically just to meet. So it wasn't overly satisfying, I would say, but maybe someday. I had hoped to go to Siberia. My mother is willing to go to Siberia, but now is not the time. So maybe someday.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Tammy? I'm not sure if I'm saying your name right. Someone has their hand raised with the name Tami. Tammy, Tommy? Okay, maybe it's a ghost hand. Um, someone asked the question if you have suggestions for working with older people and also what it was like. One person says they're working with their family and encountering resistance. Is there anything more you can share about what it was like working with family members through difficult stories?
My grandmother really, really wanted to do this. She was the one who initiated, really, and then I kind of got involved in different ways and pushed her. Like, then it was more like a collaborative, and I had interest, and she was willing to kind of go along. So then it became more of a collaboration, but she was very much the one who initiated and was ready to talk. The tricky thing for me was really navigating me feeling sometimes like I was stirring up so many things that were emotional for her that I worried almost that I was taking her too far. For I haven't really encountered resistance. My parents have been amazingly open to all the crazy things I asked them to do and answer. I did when I went to Estonia, I did there were people that I wanted to interview. I did encounter resistance with one particular relative who was not at all ready to talk, and really I just left it that was not a time to interview him, and I basically left it that I wouldn't interview him, and then kind of just worked on developing a relationship with him, and that maybe in the future, hopefully, I would interview him, but I don't think it's something that I would push. And I guess while I was there, I really just focused on relationship building. Yeah, I guess for me that was sort of my approach, that if somebody was resistant, I it wasn't really something I was going to pursue more than trying to just work on the relationship.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
And Tammy's questions in the chat. Did your mom and grandmother share feelings in regards to finding out about the new loves and new lives post-war?
Sure.
To finding out about Harald's new family in Siberia.
Well, we did, I mean, they were both wanting to find out. Yeah. So my grandmother, wanted to find out whatever she could. She was interested in me going to find out about, we had talked about my mother going to Siberia. My grandmother was aware of that. She was interested in us finding out whatever we could. So she was definitely for that. And she was not, my grandmother's a very practical woman. She understood that he was in Siberia and probably stuck there, and understood that he would have another life there. That was not really the problem. The problem was more the lies and secrecy that kind of was caused by family. And so So yeah, my grandmother really wanted to know about his life and would have been interested to know more as much as we could have known. So definitely, yeah.
Yeah, believe it or not, everybody, Rebecca's done a lovely job of condensing the story to present it in a 90-minute public event, but there's even more twists and turns and the stories of the letters, and it's really an incredible story that I hope we'll hear more of. And that there's more to explore in the full thesis. So thank you so much, Rebecca, for sharing this. There's a lot of gratitude in the chat that I'll download and make sure to share with you. Clearly, this work has a lot of resonances with other work happening, work like Saidiya Hartman's. Our program has been thinking a lot about the relationships between oral history and fiction. We did a whole event series on that last year, and we'll send out a follow-up email with a link to the YouTube channel where you can watch those events. We have a lot of students and alums working on speculative oral history, fantasy oral history oriented more towards the future than the past. And it's really exciting to see all these ways of playing with the imagination. So you've been such a lovely audience. I really appreciated that opportunity to see how these questions and themes resonate with everybody. And thank you, Rebecca, for creating that interactive experience for us. I'll ask the students who are in the workshop class to stick around for a few minutes. And everyone else, I think, can feel free to go. Rebecca, do you have any closing words?
No, I just want to thank everybody. This has been a really wonderful experience, and thank you for sharing all of your thoughts and ideas and silences and experiences. So thank you, everybody. It's been wonderful. I really appreciate it. Thanks for the time, Amy.
You're welcome. Thank you. Good night, everyone.
Good night. Bye.